Welcome to I Love This Thing So Fricking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I am joined by Brandy J. Lewis, a doctor of English teaching at California State University of Los Angeles, who is trying to find a place for her eclectic background. Welcome back to the show, Brandy.
Thank you for having me again.
Thanks for being here. So, here's how this works. Brandy will have 3 minutes to talk about something that she loves. This can be a person, place, thing, concept, activity, anything she wants. Our only requirement is that she loves it wholeheartedly and wants to tell us why. Are you ready, Brandy?
I'm ready.
Good. Got my timer here. Now, what do you love so freaking much?
Well, the thing that I love so freaking much is archival research. We tend to think of archives as repositories or places that hold and collect things from documents, materials, anything that can be of value. But they, like a great junkyard hunt or let's say a small family festival, can have so many treasures that not a lot of people realize are there. Archives originally after the French Revolution were places that were accessible to scholars and certain figures as proof of documents, proof of certain historical truths happening in more positive ways. But today, they're everything from libraries, public accessible archives, museums, and depending on the respective archive, you can access it free as a public member of society, or you would have to go through a university system. Now, again, archives hold so many different things. And because these are documents held from the past, whether recent past or long past, it's like touching history. You can go and find both the good and bad of society. You can learn more about the people important to us, people who are also those unsung voices, or even historical moments that get overlooked because of just how much exists within a particular archive. And because you enter oftentimes more with questions than answers, it's really this opportunity to think about the present and the future in different ways. For instance, in my research, a lot of people oftentimes think about comics fandom as its own separate, more recent thing. But if you actually look into particular archives, you'll find traces that show that comics fandom really jumped out of and through science fiction fandom during the 1960s as comic producers DC and Marvel started to create new heroes and new titles that a mid 20th century audience and generation really grew attached to. And so you can really find things that speak to what we know now, but also nuance and even change how we think about things in very eclectic ways. Archival research is oftentimes a lot of work. You never know what you're going to find. And because of that, it's always good to have like a pen and a piece of paper to take notes, to go through the documents and see kind of what's there from what you know. But again, when you find something that is this true piece of history that you are either looking for or you maybe knew nothing about.
Go ahead and finish your thought.
Thank you. It's this amazing piece of gold that really stands out. And that just helps me continue going back to the work on and on again.
That's wonderful. Thank you for telling us about archival research today.
No, thank you for having me.
How did your interest in archival research begin?
As an undergrad student, I'm first generation Mexican American transgender scholar, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I, existed at a time where transgender knowledge was not really celebrated. And I didn't know if I wanted to just stay in like typical lines of business. But I found at the university I went to, they had this huge collection of science fiction, the Eden Collection at UC Riverside. And it's the world's largest collection of science fiction, fantasy, and fandom material. And because of the opportunities I had to explore that as a student and faculty members who supported me going into the archive to learn a little bit more about sci-fi and literature, I just fell in love with it and continued that all the way through until my doctoral dissertation just this past year.
I really like how you referred to archives as a place where you find truth, but the other word you used besides truth was treasure. So talk a little more about finding treasures and truths.
The difficulty with archives is that we think that they're unbiased repositories. Going into them, we think we will find the truth of what happened. And it's messy. It's kind of like you go in and you find a trace of truth, and that jumps onto other documents and forms of research you'll do to find truth. And it's multiple nuances and questions. But as you're working and you're trying to figure out how, let's say, for instance, fandom arose, or how African Americans and queer where Latinos took to fandom in certain ways. You'll find articles, essays, drawings, letters that nobody maybe has ever witnessed or seen. And so there's this little thrill where you find out that during the 1980s, as the AIDS crisis was coming out, one fan, particular in a source that I found, saw fandom as this place where he could talk about his coming out experience and how he's been hiding that because he didn't know whether or not it would be acceptable. And yet fandom really was the space where you could be who you were and talk about the things you love. And so finding a treasure like that as a queer person of mixed race, it was just like astounding. And like, how do I bring this work out while also recognizing this is only a piece of history that we think we know?
It is just a piece, and also it is a piece. It is there.
Right.
You mentioned a moment ago, coming into academia at a time where queer voices and voices of color are not necessarily at the forefront or encouraged, but those voices are there and you were able to find them.
Right. And so, like, on the one hand, where you have to recognize that the archive is already baked, they only take certain documents based upon who held those documents or what is of interest to the institution.
Mm-hmm.
You also see those other moments where figures from the past who get overlooked find their way in and trouble the institutional whitewashing, if we want to call it, or just the disciplinary nature of archival collection.
Yeah, it sounds like if there is a way to find an encompassing truth, you need to have a more encompassing archive. It needs to be more able for more things to be collected so people can look back someday and say, "Oh, I actually do know all the different facets of what was going on there because we were so open for recording everything."
Thankfully, with the archive that I worked at, because it's so vast, you could jump across collection material and really get a sense of what people were thinking about and going through personally and culturally at their respective times, while also finding those little bits and pieces that really push you to think about things differently.
Talk a little more about that, because you mentioned before that archival research, learning more about the past, can change your perspective on the world and the present. What's the way that that's affected you?
A lot of my research has been about how do fans use various forms of literature to think about the present, past, and future in different ways. And particularly my research thinks about the furry fandom, this group of fans who, for one reason or another, like anthropomorphic animals, such as in the Warrior Cat series, The Lion King, The Bad Guys was really popular in Zootopia.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of the archival research, looking at where this fandom came from, how they were received, and how fans lived and thought through the different decades that have occurred since the 1970s and 80s. One of the things that got troubled was, as a fan, you think you have a good sense of things, that you have a good hold or understanding of what is happening in your space, because fandom is very personal, just as is very collective. And yet, when you go into the archives and you find something that shows that people were considering questions of difference in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s while talking about cartoon animals, that changes the perspective that only within recent years have furries been part of this conversation on sexuality and difference and the discourses that get drawn up about them. And so furries are often imagined as hypersexual, as wild, as frenetic. And when you come in as a fan of something and try to like tell people, hey, wait, that's all fandom, that's people. We're wild, eclectic, and have our weird niche things.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back at these historic documents that nuance the conversation, it really stops and tells you, wait, there's so much more that I have to learn. Even just when we think we have a good hold of something, oftentimes fans and historical moments move away or outside of the boundaries we try to put on them to limit our objects of interest.
Is there anything that you don't like about archival research? And if so, how do you handle that?
That's a great question, because archival research is not this utopic thing, as exciting as I make it seem to be. And, you have films like Indiana Jones, National Treasure, all these historical films that think about going into the past as this adventure.
A literal treasure hunt in many cases.
Right. You do see a lot of painful private things, and the work itself is long and tenuous. You're oftentimes by yourself looking at documents. And if you're lucky, the librarian might ask you what you're looking at or ask you how you're doing, but it could be often very lonely. And that makes part of the critical work of trying to think differently about the objects much harder. But particularly when you're looking at texts and documents that connect to issues like the AIDS crisis, like what Ronaldo Walcott also calls the long emancipation of African Americans and Black subjects, you see the struggles people went through. You see the pains that they felt as they lost certain things of their fandom or they lost a loved one, just as much as you would see their joys, their pleasures, their relationships that fandom oftentimes allowed for them. And so just as often as I would see a fan letter from a fan to their favorite artists, you would also see a letter talking about how somebody lost a child. And that's difficult to sit with because the relationships you build with these people as you're researching them really grows. And that also can affect the research you're doing.
Yeah, it makes sense that if you are in the endeavor of finding a comprehensive truth of the past and of the world, that's going to include all the good, all the bad, all the beautiful, all the ugly of this world we live in.
And, Black feminists and activist voices have always challenged us to not make godlike heroes out of the figures we see important to us because life is messy. But I think archival research really puts that in full face of you because you have documented proof right there that somebody said or did something that challenges how you think of them or about the connections that you're building out. Again, archival research can be very lonely, but it also can really affect you emotionally in both good ways and bad. And so there's a real practice that you have to develop for yourself when doing the work that you can't really ever prepare yourself for.
Do you have any advice for someone who's just getting started in archival research for how to handle that?
The thing that I often tell younger students is start off with something you're passionate about, something maybe you have questions about. And if you have an archive that collects materials in relationship to that, just go in and start looking through boxes, seeing what you find. And new questions will come out. Maybe some answers might come. But really, part of the beauty of it is the experience and how we always have something new to learn about the things we love. If you're someone who's not in education, but you want to get a chance to do this work, there are a lot of great online repositories available. I know with furries, there's the Conference Archive with FUR instead of ER for conference. It's an online digital database where people can look at fanzines, fan magazines, and ephemera from the furry community as it was developing in the late 20th century. If you are just simply looking for like music and you want to hear all these different recordings that maybe people overlook, the Internet Archive has this astounding collection of recorded media from the early 1900s, perhaps even prior to that. And so we're very thankful today, of course, to have the internet and all the repositories online that it holds available to us. You can literally start archival research in multiple ways. It's just, do you have a repository near you that's available from a university? Or will you be going online and peeking through Google to see what you can collect?
Brandy, thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
Thank you for having me once again.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you would like to learn more about archival research or our guest Brandy, you can find her social media information in the episode description. And if you have something you love so freaking much you want to tell me all about it, consider this your invitation to join the show. I Love This Thing So Freaking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed and edited by Sophie A. Katz. You can find us at Through the Window on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Tumblr. That is THROU the Window at all those social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.